welcome to week 7. This week we're looking at scoping information and analysing topics. For me this is a fairly important topic. However, what I want to deal with first is assessment 2. Now sadly, and this is a confession on my part, there was a mistake on the due date given as Monday the 15th. Previously we've had a later due date, which has meant that the week 7 lecture actually covers the material for the assessment. So this sadly will only have a 3-day relevance, and I'm hoping most of you who listen to it over this weekend should get some benefits out of it. If not, I apologise. If you haven't already, I want you to have a look in the folder on Milo that has all the assessment material within it. What you'll find in there is a description of the actual assessment, the actual task template if you want to use that template, and the 2 sources which are to be used for the actual assignment. The actual task itself is simply a comparison report on academic and non-academic sources. The description of it, as you'll find on slide 5 of the PowerPoint, is that you're provided with 2 pieces of information on the same topic. You must compare these sources according to the following criteria. Now for me those criteria are essential, and you have to cover all of them. You have to define them all in some way, and this again is something I can't overemphasise. Don't assume that your markers, or in this case your audience, know what you're actually talking about, so please define each one, even in I guess small or marginal terms in that sense. But nonetheless, make sure you do some sort of definition. Now the 5 things you've got to cover essentially are audience, authority, transparency, objectivity and currency. Now I spoke about all those last week, so I don't need to go back over them. If you wish, you can use the template provided, and I think most people will be using that, only for expedience if nothing else. The other thing that you could probably consider doing, if you feel that inclined, is possibly attempt to do it as an essay. I think this is quite cumbersome and quite difficult, given that you've got 5 fairly discrete areas that you have to cover. However, that does not say that you can't attempt it, providing you actually cover those areas, the 5 that I've just mentioned. I don't see that as necessarily an impediment to doing it that way. It's just a little bit more difficult, and I think as a second assessment, particularly at this level, it's probably easier to use the template that's been provided. On slide 6, there's a bit of detail about the task length. I'm expecting something approximately around 800 words. I've told my attending students that I would accept more. I mean, generally we offer 10% anyway, so you're looking at nearly 900 words. I would expect it not to be under that. I think 800 words is a fairly reasonable amount to cover the material. Anything less, I don't think you'll do it any justice. I would expect, and so does your distance tutor, expect that it'll be double lined. You'll use a font around 11 or 12. Use Times New Roman. And please ensure, just as a matter of course, when you proofread your work, that the paragraphing and correct spelling and grammar are all checked, if not double checked, not just through your word program, if that's what you're using, but just you visually. This is important. There are a lot of marks lost through poor proofreading, and as far as I'm concerned, there's probably 1 or 2 grades just in the proofread. So you might complete a work, leave it for a day or 2 and come back to it, and when you polish that work, for want of a better phrase, the increase in grades is usually appreciable. Like I said, 1, sometimes even 2 grades if it's done well. The key guideline is actually in slide 7. Now for me, what I'd be looking for, certainly of the attending students, and as the distance tutor will be looking for from the distance students, is actually the application of the evaluation criteria for both sources. So looking at the reliability test, in other words, the 5 things that we've already mentioned, those things have to be applied in some way to both sources. What you'll be marked on or graded on is your ability to analyse and identify these sources, and whether they're suitable for academic purposes as a result. So in other words, you're doing a measure of these things according to those 5 guidelines or points, and depending on your analysis will obviously determine your grade. The other thing that obviously comes into some, is a minor part of your mark, is the standards of presentation. So we would expect you to present your work in an academically acceptable manner. The due date for this piece of work is next week. It's Monday. Monday, the 15th of April at 4 p.m. It's a Milo submission for all students, unless you otherwise notify your tutor. Otherwise, we expect it at that time. Please don't be late unless you've got a reasonable excuse. And make sure that you actually ask for an extension if you need one in advance from your tutor. Please don't ask on Monday afternoon if you can have an extension, because for the most part you should be finished by then, or at least in my books you should be. On slides 10 and 11 you have copies of the actual template that you should use. You can use the headings on there, and as you can see, it has a range of reliability tests, goes down through authority, audience, transparency, objectivity, and currency, etc. You have to actually kind of make some sort of statement about each of those, obviously bearing in mind that you have to do both sources, which means that your word count is going to be affected to some degree by how much you answered each one. I would expect some of these to be fairly heavily populated and others not, depending on how much the test, how much, or what you find out, I guess. The other thing is, and to me is the most important thing, is some sort of overall assessment of the source. Now, what I would like, and I said this at the start, is some sort of definition, just even a sentence or part of a sentence, to define what each one of those actually mean. So when I say what each one of those means, I mean which reliability test you're talking about, and what that actually means. The two sources you'll use, source one is the Climate Health Impact Report, and source two is the Age newspaper article. Now, they're written by the same author, just in very different contexts, and I think you have to bear that in mind in terms of your analysis of what is appropriate or inappropriate for using an academic, for an academic purpose. Moving into part C of the PowerPoint, what I want to briefly look at is the nature and purpose of scoping information and the analysis of topics to guide, obviously, your approach to answering assignment questions, etc. I take it for granted that most of you will now begin to be having, I guess, a depth of research skills, for instance, that you can actually use search engines appropriately, and you're beginning to develop smart reading techniques, which means you can efficiently get through material and know what's suitable and what's not. That you're actually beginning to apply, or at least think about, reliability criteria, which we outlined last week, week 6. But this week I want to look at, like I said, scoping information. On slide 17 I posed the question, how do you approach researching material for an essay or an assignment task? Well, the first thing that you have to do is some sort of question analysis. So even if you have a statement that you have to dissect, or at least discuss, or an actual question that you have to answer, you have to understand what that question involves. What is the requirements of the actual task? I guess the process really is about breaking down the question, looking for, first of all, the key terms, which generally need to be defined at some point in your answer for that question, but also the instructions. What are you actually meant to do with that material once you've found it? Now, in some cases, you'll get key words, something like compare or discuss, but there may be other words like contrast or instruct, or even words like outline. And I've put an example in there: compare and discuss the financial viability of non-fossil fuel-based alternative energy options for Australia for 2011 and the future. Now, what you'd have to do with a question like this, straight from the top, is to think about what actual energy sources, for instance, are available in Australia and that are viable. For me, that would be a fairly straightforward analysis of what I know about, literally from the media, etc., and over 48 years of my life, finding out about things like solar, wind, etc. At its most basic, when you break down a question for an assessment task, first of all, you're looking for keywords like things like compare and discuss, as I said earlier. The other words that I would pick out of this particular question is things like viability and alternative energy. So I'm looking at, and I'm probably underlining or highlighting within the question, these particular things, because they're the ones that I have to concentrate in terms of the search. Now, in this case, the word viability narrows our search somewhat, because there may be a lot of alternative energy sources, but most of them aren't viable in a real sense, and certainly not compared to options, say solar and wind, for instance, which are already being utilised in different countries, or at least internationally.